The first sound was a siren, a distant, mournful cry that sliced through the autumn dusk. It was an abstract noise, a feature of the urban soundscape that meant nothing until it was screaming for you. For Sarah Jenkins, it was the soundtrack to the world tilting on its axis. The second sound was Frank's voice, a raw, guttural roar of pure, helpless rage. "Sarah, somebody help! They stabbed her! My God, somebody help!" Her own sounds were muted, a series of wet, gasping breaths that didn't seem to draw any air. She was on her back on the cold, gritty pavement outside the Northgate Diner, the familiar smell of asphalt and fallen leaves, now mixed with the coppery tang of her own blood. A constellation of streetlights swam lazily above her, blurring into a watercolor smear. Pain was a global phenomenon, a crackling fire that had consumed her entire being. It wasn't sharp or located in one place, it was everywhere. It was in her shoulder, her arms, her belly. It was a hot, spreading stain beneath her scrubs. She tried to push herself up, a primal instinct to get away, but her limbs refused the command. Her hand, slick and red, came to rest on her abdomen and her fingers brushed against something foreign, the hilt of a cheap pocketknife still embedded just below her ribs. A wave of nausea and dizzying unreality washed over her. This wasn't happening. This was the kind of thing you saw on the late-night news, a brief, tragic story from a bad part of town. Not here. Not in Northgate, Pennsylvania. Not to her. And not to Frank. Frank. She turned her head, a monumental effort that sent lightning bolts of agony through her neck. He was on his knees a few feet away, his old, proud Marine's body contorted in despair. His blind eyes were wide, fixed on the empty space where she lay. His hands, usually so steady when he navigated the familiar terrain of his home, hovered uselessly in the air, trembling, wanting to help but not knowing where to touch. Terrified of causing more harm. The sight of his powerlessness was somehow more painful than the knife still lodged in her flesh. "They're gone, Frank," she managed, her voice a choked whisper. "They're gone." The siren was louder now, a physical presence that vibrated in her bones. Red and blue lights flashed across Frank's face, illuminating the tears carving paths through the weathered landscape of his cheeks. He was 71 years old, a man who had faced down his own demons, and he was weeping like a lost child. She had tried to protect him. That was the only thought that pierced through the fog of pain. She had put herself between him and them, and this was the result. The world was fading to a pinprick of light, the siren and Frank's desperate cries melting into a single, overwhelming hum. Her last conscious thought wasn't of fear or even of pain. It was a flare of pure, incandescent rage. They did this to him. Earlier that day. The morning had been a portrait of tranquility, the kind of quiet autumn day that felt like a gift. Sunlight the color of weak tea filtered through the large picture window of Sergeant Frank Miller's modest bungalow. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air and cast a warm glow on the polished wood of his late wife's piano. "You're going to make me fat, Sarah," Frank grumbled, though the corner of his mouth twitched in a nascent smile. He sat in his favorite armchair, a worn leather beast that had molded to his form over decades. Sarah Jenkins laughed, the sound light and easy in the quiet room. "Sergeant, with the amount of walking I make you do, I think we can afford a single slice of apple pie. Besides, it's Thursday. It's our tradition." She finished checking his blood pressure, her movements a study in gentle efficiency. At 32, she possessed a calm that seemed beyond her years, and necessary armor for a career spent in the chaotic trenches of ERs, and now the quiet intimacy of home care. "Tradition is for the birds," he retorted, but he didn't protest further. This small ritual, a weekly trip to the Northgate Diner for a slice of pie a la mode, was the anchor of his week. It was his brief parole from the four walls that had become his world after a training accident stole his sight 20 years ago. Sarah wasn't just his nurse. She was his navigator, his narrator, his bridge to the world he could no longer see. She described the world to him in vivid detail, painting pictures with her words. "The maple tree on the corner is on fire," she'd say. "It's all crimson and gold. You'd love it." He would just grunt, but she knew he was storing the image away, adding it to his mental gallery. Later that afternoon, she stopped at a local coffee shop to pick up the specific brand of hazelnut decaf he favored. The line was short, But the atmosphere was soured by two young men at the front. They were loud, dressed in clothes that cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, and radiated an aura of impatient entitlement. One of them, the taller one with slicked back hair, was complaining loudly into his phone about the hick town and its lack of a decent espresso bar. An elderly woman in front of Sarah shifted her weight, leaning heavily on her cane. The two young men, finished with their order, simply pushed past her to grab their drinks, jostling the woman so she stumbled. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm. She steadied the woman with a hand on her arm. "You almost knocked her over." The one who had been on the phone, Kyle Dalton, glanced over his shoulder, his eyes dismissive. "She was in the way. People should watch where they're going." His companion, his younger brother Josh, snickered. "Yeah, relax, Florence Nightingale." Sarah held their gaze for a moment, her own eyes conveying a disapproval so potent it was almost a physical force. They scoffed, grabbed their overpriced coffees, and swaggered out, leaving a wake of resentment in the small shop. Sarah shook her head, filed the unpleasant encounter away, and ordered Frank's coffee. They were just two more arrogant kids, a common enough species. She had no idea she was looking at the architects of her future. The attack, when it came, was a whirlwind of that same casual cruelty escalated to its violent conclusion. As Sarah guided Frank out of the diner, the cool evening air a welcome relief, they were there again. The Dalton brothers and a few of their friends, leaning against a gleaming black SUV, music thumping from its speakers. They were drinking beer from bottles, their laughter sharp and ugly. As they passed, Josh Dalton stuck out his leg. It was a lazy, thoughtless act of malice. Frank, whose senses were attuned to the slightest disruption in his path, caught his foot and pitched forward. Sarah's grip on his arm was the only thing that kept him from falling flat on his face. "Whoa, watch it, old man," Josh slurred, a smirk on his face. The group laughed. Frank straightened up, his back rigid, his face a thundercloud. The years fell away, and for a moment he was Sergeant Miller again, a man who commanded respect and did not suffer fools. His voice was gravelly and cold. "You do well to show some respect, son." Kyle stepped forward, his chest puffed out. He looked Frank up and down with open contempt. "Respect for what? Some blind freeloader living off the government?" The insult landed like a physical blow. Before Frank could retort, Sarah stepped between them, a small woman creating a human shield in front of a giant. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was steady. "Leave him alone. We're leaving. Just stop." "Get out of the way, bitch," Kyle snarled, and shoved her hard. The sound of the shove, the insult to Sarah, was a lit fuse in Frank's mind. All his training, all his protective instinct ignited. He let out a wordless roar and lunged blindly toward Kyle's voice. He was a force of nature, but an undirected one. He missed, stumbling past them. It was all the excuse they needed. Kyle grabbed Frank from behind, locking him in a brutish hug. "You see? He's crazy! He attacked me!" he yelled to his friends. Yeah, his face flushed with alcohol and rage, fumbled in his pocket and produced a small, silver pocket knife. It was a cheap, flimsy thing, but deadly enough. "Josh, don't!" one of their friends yelled, suddenly sobered. But it was too late. As Josh lunged toward the restrained Frank, Sarah screamed and threw herself back into the path of the blade. The first stab was a shocking, fiery sting in her shoulder. The second caught her in the arm as she tried to shield herself. The impacts were clumsy, brutal, sickening thuds. She didn't feel them as individual wounds, but as a total, catastrophic system failure. He stabbed her again and again, 9 times in a chaotic frenzy, his face a mask of panicked violence. The world dissolved into a cacophony of her own pained grunts, Frank's enraged, helpless bellows, and the sudden panicked shouts of the other boys. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The Daltons, their faces pale with the sudden realization of their crime, scrambled into their SUV. Tires squealed on the pavement, and they were gone. Sarah crumpled to the ground, a marionette with its strings cut, the world dimming around her as the first siren began its lonely lament in the distance. The ER at Northgate General was a controlled hurricane of noise and motion. Voices overlapped, machines beeped insistently, and the metallic tang of antiseptic fought a losing battle with the smell of blood. Sarah was the storm's epicenter. A doctor, her face grim, barked out orders. Pressure on the abdomen. Get me 2 units of O-neg. Now, I count 9 wounds, people. 9. In a curtained-off bay down the hall, Frank Miller sat on the edge of a gurney. A nurse had cleaned the scrapes on his hands, but no one could touch the wound inside him. He was being questioned by a tired-looking police officer, Detective Wallace, who had the weary, cynical air of a man who had seen it all and was impressed by none of it. "So, you got into an argument with some kids?" Wallace asked, his pen scratching across a small notepad. "It wasn't an argument," Frank rasped, his voice raw. "They assaulted my nurse. They tripped me. They stabbed her. Can't you understand that?" Right, Wallace said, his tone placating. "And you didn't get a look at them?" Frank's hands clenched into fists on his lap. The sheer infuriating stupidity of the question was a fresh insult. "I'm blind," he said, the words tight with contained fury. "I've told 3 different people that already. I heard their voices. Arrogant. Young. They called me a freeloader." Okay, Wallace sighed, jotting down the word freeloader as if it were a solid clue. "We'll, look into it. See if the diner's cameras caught anything." His tone was a promise wrapped in apathy. He saw a drunken scuffle, a paperwork headache, a case that would likely go nowhere. He didn't see a hero or a victim. He saw a file. Miles away in a house that resembled a modern art museum, Kyle Dalton was on the phone with his father. His voice was a panicked squeak. "There was some trouble. This old guy, he went crazy, and his nurse, she got cut." Robert Dalton, a man who moved through the world as if he owned it, listened in cold silence. He didn't ask if his sons were all right. He didn't ask about the nurse. His questions were surgical strikes. "Did anyone see you? Names? License plate? Did you use a credit card at the diner?" No, we paid cash," Kyle stammered. "Good," Robert said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Say nothing. To anyone. Don't leave the house. Call Josh. I'll handle it." He hung up and immediately dialed his lawyer, a man known for making mountains of evidence disappear into molehills of legal doubt. The machine was already in motion. The next day, Sarah drifted in and out of a fog of morphine and pain. A man in an expensive suit, his smile as sterile as the room's white walls, appeared at her bedside. He introduced himself as Mr. Harrison, the hospital administrator. He carried a bouquet of flowers that looked plastic. "Sarah, a terrible, terrible ordeal," he began, his voice a low, confidential murmur. "The entire Northgate General family is thinking of you." He paused, his smile tightening. "Now, as we move forward, we need to be very careful about how we frame this incident, for insurance purposes and to avoid any potential liabilities." He began to subtly suggest that perhaps the fight was a personal matter that had unfortunately occurred after her shift. He was trying to sever the connection between her work and the attack to protect the hospital from a workers' compensation claim and a lawsuit over inadequate security for its home care staff. Sarah, though weak, felt a surge of cold fury that cut through the morphine haze. "I was protecting my patient," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "A patient of this hospital. It wasn't personal." Of course, Harrison said, patting her hand with condescending sympathy. "Let's just focus on getting you better." He left the flowers on her bedside table and departed, leaving the scent of corporate self-preservation in his wake. 2 days later, Frank sat in the suffocating silence of his bungalow. A social worker had dropped him off. The police hadn't called. The hospital had only told him that Sarah was stable. He felt like a caged animal, blind and powerless, while the predators who had attacked his only friend roamed free. The system had failed. The apathy of the detective, the weaselly words of the administrator, it was a conspiracy of indifference. He fumbled in a drawer for an old, sturdy flip phone, a relic from a time before touchscreens. His fingers, clumsy with age and rage, found the pre-programmed button he hadn't pressed in years. He held it down, and the phone dialed. A strong, clear voice answered on the second ring. "Reyes." "Gunny," Frank said, his own voice cracking with the effort of holding it together. "It's Frank Miller." "Sergeant Miller, it's been too long, sir. How are you?" The warmth in Gunnery Sergeant Reyes' voice was genuine. Frank's composure shattered. Not good, Gunny. Not good at all. He recounted the entire story, the words tumbling out in a torrent of grief and fury. The insult, the shove, the knife, the blood, the dismissive cop, the silence. He poured all of his helplessness into the phone. On the other end, in a barracks in North Carolina, Gunny Reyes listened without a single interruption. The warmth in his demeanor evaporated, replaced by something cold and hard as forged steel. When Frank finished, there was a long pause. "I hear you, Sergeant," Reyes finally said, his voice low and resonant with deadly purpose. "We all hear you. You just stay put. Help is coming." Against her doctor's advice, Sarah was discharged 2 days later. The hospital needed the bed. She was sent home in a taxi, a bag of prescriptions in one hand and a heart full of terror in the other. Her small house, usually a sanctuary, felt like a trap. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside her window, sent a jolt of fear through her. She was a victim, and now she was alone, a sitting duck. She didn't sleep that night, just sat in a chair in her living room, wrapped in a blanket, watching the dark windows and waiting for a dawn that felt like it would never come. But it did. As the first pale, gray light of morning seeped into the room, she forced her aching body up and limped to the kitchen to make tea. She glanced out the window, expecting the same empty, indifferent street, and the world tilted on its axis for the second time in a week. They were everywhere. On her lawn, on the sidewalk, standing in silent, perfectly spaced intervals down the entire length of her street. They weren't in uniform, just jeans and hoodies and jackets, but there was no mistaking them. Their posture, their stillness, the absolute sense of purpose that radiated from them. They were Marines. Dozens of them. Hundreds. A car would slowly cruise by and she could see more of them inside. They weren't armed. They weren't shouting. They were simply there. A silent, formidable, protective legion. A human fortress. Sarah's hand went to her mouth, and the mug she was holding slipped from her grasp, shattering on the linoleum floor. She didn't hear it. Tears, hot and silent, streamed down her face. These weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of overwhelming, world-shaking relief. At the end of her driveway, a stocky, powerful man with a severe haircut and eyes that had seen the world caught her gaze. It was Gunny Reyes. He looked at her brokenness and her fear, and he gave her a single, slow, deliberate nod. The message was as clear as a rifle shot in the quiet morning air. "You are not alone. We have the watch." The story broke like a dam. Maria Flores, a young reporter for the local Northgate News affiliate, got the tip from her cameraman who sounded like he'd just seen a UFO land. "You need to get to Elm Street. I'm not kidding. I think the entire U.S. Marine Corps just invaded." When Maria arrived, the scene was utterly surreal. The silent, stoic men standing sentinel. The confused neighbors peering from behind their curtains. A single Northgate police cruiser parked a block away, its occupants clearly having decided that this was above their pay grade. Maria, her reporter's instincts buzzing, cautiously approached Gunny Reyes. She expected a fiery speech, a declaration of war. What she got was far more powerful. "We aren't a protest," Reyes said, his voice calm and steady, refusing to be drawn into sensationalism. "We're a community. One of our own was in trouble, his protector was grievously wounded, and the system was quiet. So we came to be loud in our own way. We're here to ensure a member of our family is safe. When one of us is in trouble, we show up. That's all." Maria's report, filmed against the incredible backdrop of the Silent Guard, was electric. She uploaded it to the station's website with the headline, "Marines Stand Guard for Nurse Stabbed Protecting Veteran." By noon, hashtag Marine Guard was the #1 trending topic in the country. The story was no longer local, it was a phenomenon. In his sleek, glass-walled office, Robert Dalton watched the report, his face a mask of cold fury. The narrative had been ripped from his control. His lawyer's voice was grim over the speakerphone. "We can't fight this head-on, Robert. It's a PR nuke. David versus Goliath, and we're Goliath holding a bloody knife." "So we change the story," Dalton snapped. "We make David look like a liar and a lunatic." Within hours, the digital assassination began. A shadowy PR firm, experts in manufacturing doubt, went to work. Anonymous blogs and a swarm of social media bots began to push a new narrative. The other side of the Northgate stabbing, one headline read. Post claimed Sarah Jenkins had a history of emotional instability and a hero complex, citing a minor workplace complaint that had been filed against her 5 years prior and summarily dismissed. They unearthed a single, decades-old disorderly conduct charge against Frank, a bar fight when he was in his 20s, and spun it to paint him as a violent, drunken veteran who had instigated the entire confrontation. The Dalton boys were reframed as the real victims, two kids who had been forced to defend themselves from a crazed attacker and his unhinged enabler. In Sarah's living room, which now felt like the safest place on earth, the digital assault felt like a second stabbing. She scrolled through the comments on her phone, her hands shaking. Attention-seeking psycho, one read. She probably stabbed herself. Good, vets are all leeches anyway. The poison seeped into her, chipping away at her resolve. Frank, sitting in the armchair Reyes had carried over from his house, listened to her read the headlines, his face carved from stone. They're cowards, Sarah, he said, his voice a low growl. They always were. They can't fight in the light, so they crawl in the mud. There was a firm knock at the door. Gunny Reyes opened it to reveal a woman who radiated an almost electric confidence. She was impeccably dressed in a sharp business suit, and she carried a leather briefcase. Miss Jenkins, she said, her voice clear and direct. My name is Jessica Chen. My father served 20 years in the Corps. I saw your story, and I just spent the last hour reading the filth the Dalton family is spreading about you and Sergeant Miller. She placed her briefcase on the coffee table. I'm a lawyer. My partners and I would be honored to offer our services. Pro bono. Hope, sharp and brilliant, pierced through the gloom. At that moment, a team was forged. Sarah and Frank were its heart. Reyes and his Marines were its shield, and Jessica Chen was its sword. Maria Flores, the reporter, who had been granted access to the house, became their voice, documenting every move. The national spotlight now shining on Northgate was making Detective Wallace's life hell. His chief was screaming at him. The mayor was screaming at the chief. And Wallace's own conscience, long dormant, was screaming at him loudest of all. The viral story had made his initial, lazy report look like a criminal act of negligence. Stung by shame and a flicker of his old, forgotten pride, Wallace started doing his job. He canvassed the area around the diner for every possible security camera. He found one on a utility pole that the owner of a nearby business said was broken. Wallace didn't buy it. He leaned on the utility company, threatening them with subpoenas until a technician discovered the raw data was still saved on a central server. He watched the footage in a darkened viewing room. It was grainy, shot from a distance, but undeniable. It showed the Dalton brothers' SUV pull up. It showed them harassing people. It showed Josh deliberately tripping Frank. It showed Sarah stepping in. And it showed the attack in all its vicious, unprovoked, cowardly horror. Wallace felt a wave of sickness and self-loathing wash over him. He also noticed something else. Another car parked down the street, which sped away moments after the Daltons. A witness. He got a partial plate. Robert Dalton, seeing his smear campaign wasn't enough, made his most audacious move yet. His lawyers filed for an emergency restraining order against Sarah Jenkins. The claim was preposterous, that Sarah had summoned a vigilante mob and that his sons, the poor, traumatized victims, were now in fear for their lives. The motion was heard by a judge who had played golf with Robert Dalton for 15 years. In a hearing that lasted less than 10 minutes, the judge granted a temporary order. Sarah was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of the Daltons and, most cruelly, from speaking about them publicly. It was a gag order, a perversion of the very legal system designed to protect people like her. The news reported it with a headline that made Sarah's blood run cold. Judge orders nurse to cease harassment of local family. She sat with Jessica Chen in the courthouse hallway, the legal papers feeling like a death sentence in her hands. She had been stabbed, vilified, and now silenced. This is what they do, Jessica said, her voice a mixture of anger and resolve. They use the system as a weapon. They want you to break. They want you to give up. She leaned in close, her eyes locking with Sarah's. Don't. The real trial is next, and we are going to burn them to the ground. The main county courthouse was a pressure cooker. Every seat was filled. On one side, a phalanx of reporters scribbled furiously. On the other, dozens of Marines in civilian clothes sat in silent, disciplined rows, a powerful, unspoken statement of support. In the center of it all was Sarah, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The Dalton brothers' lawyer was a silver-haired shark named Marcus Thorne, a man known for turning victims into aggressors. His opening statement was a masterclass in deflection. He didn't deny a knife was involved. Instead, he began to meticulously dismantle the character of Sarah and Frank. He painted Frank as a ticking time bomb of PTSD, a violent drunk prone to aggressive outbursts. He twisted Sarah's exemplary nursing record into a hero complex, suggesting she was a woman who actively sought out confrontation to play the savior. This was not an unprovoked attack, ladies and gentlemen, Thorne declared, his voice resonating with false sincerity. This was a tragic case of self-defense. Two young men, terrified by a charging, unstable man and his equally volatile accomplice. When Sarah took the stand, her testimony was quiet but powerful. She recounted the events simply, factually. But on cross-examination, Thorne was merciless. He brought up the dismissed complaint from years ago. He twisted her words. So you, a trained medical professional, chose to escalate the situation instead of simply walking away? He asked, his voice dripping with condescension. She held her ground, but by the end, she was trembling. Then it was Detective Wallace's turn. Everyone expected a dry recitation of police procedure. But Wallace walked to the stand with the grim determination of a man on a mission of atonement. He first presented the security footage. The courtroom watched in horrified silence as the events played out on a large screen. The trip, the shove, the brutal one-sided assault. The images stripped away every lie, every insinuation. Thorne objected vehemently, but the judge, feeling the weight of 100 cameras and the burning stare of the jury, had no choice but to allow it. Then, Wallace looked directly at the jury. The DA has asked me to testify about the evidence, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I have to say one more thing. When this case first came to my desk, I didn't give it the attention it deserved. I saw a report, not people. I was wrong. He took a deep breath, and his gaze shifted to Sarah and Frank. I failed Ms. Jenkins and Sergeant Miller. I apologize to them, and to this court. The truth is what you see on that screen, an act of heroic compassion met with an act of despicable cowardice. A wave of gasps and murmurs swept through the courtroom. Robert Dalton's face was purple with rage. It was a stunning public confession, a redemption played out under the harshest of lights. The final blow came from the witness Jessica Chen and Maria Flores had spent weeks tracking down. Using the partial plate from Wallace's video, they had identified the driver of the other car. He was a college student who had been so terrified by a visit from Robert Dalton's fixers that he'd been hiding out of state. Bolstered by a promise of protection from Reyes's men, he agreed to testify. The young man walked to the stand, visibly nervous, and recounted what he saw. His testimony was clear, unbiased, and utterly devastating. He corroborated every detail of the video and delivered the final, damning detail. After they stabbed her, he said, his voice shaking. They got back in the car. And the one who did it, he was laughing. During a recess, Robert Dalton, his empire of lies collapsing around him, finally dropped his mask of civility. He cornered Sarah in the hallway as she was getting a cup of water. His face was a contorted sneer, his voice a low, venomous hiss. You think you've won? You're a nobody, a broke nurse with a martyr complex. I will spend every last dollar I have to appeal this. I will drag your name through the mud until you wish you'd bled out on that sidewalk. He took a step closer, his presence menacing. Before Sarah could even flinch, 3 figures materialized at her side. Gunny Reyes and 2 of his largest Marines, who had been standing guard down the hall, moved in so silently it was as if they'd teleported. They didn't speak. They didn't touch anyone. They simply stood there, flanking Sarah, their bodies a wall of impassive, immovable muscle, their eyes fixed on Dalton. Robert Dalton, a man who had terrified people his entire life, looked, for the first time, genuinely afraid. The raw, physical powerlessness he felt was palpable. He sputtered, took a half step back, and then turned and scurried away. It was a complete and utter moral surrender. The jury returned in 47 minutes. The foreman stood, a middle-aged woman with tears in her eyes, and read the verdict. On the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon against Kyle Dalton, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. A wave of emotion crashed through the room. On the charge of aggravated assault against Josh Dalton, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Sarah burst into tears, not of pain, but of catharsis, and fell into a one-armed embrace with Frank, who was weeping openly. In the back rows, the Marines didn't cheer or clap. They simply gave a single, unified, silent nod of approval. Justice, long delayed, had finally been delivered. The fall of the House of Dalton was as swift as it was total. The trial had put a magnifying glass on Robert Dalton's affairs, and federal investigators, spurred by the intense public interest, began to dig. A montage of newspaper headlines and news clips told the story. Dalton Development under investigation for fraud. Dalton Family Charity revealed as slush fund. Robert Dalton indicted on racketeering charges. The final image was of Kyle and Josh, stripped of their designer clothes and their arrogance, being led in orange jumpsuits into a state prison. 6 months later, Sarah stood at a podium in a university auditorium. The scars on her arm and neck were visible, but she no longer tried to hide them. They were part of her story. The room was filled with nursing students, doctors, and veterans, their faces rapt. "A year ago, I was just a nurse," she said, her voice clear and strong. "My world was my patient, my car, and my home. But I learned that my world was connected to a much larger one. I learned that our systems, the ones designed to protect us, are only as strong as the people who demand they work. And I learned that the most powerful force on this earth is not wealth or power, but loyalty." She announced the formation of the Frank Miller Foundation for Patient and Provider Safety, funded by a flood of anonymous donations. Its dual mission, to provide legal aid and advocacy for healthcare workers assaulted on the job, and to create community support networks for elderly and disabled veterans. In the front row, Frank Miller sat listening, his face alight with a pride so profound it seemed to illuminate him from within. At his feet lay a handsome golden retriever, a guide dog provided by the foundation, its head resting on Frank's knee. For the first time in years, a deep and abiding peace had settled over him. 1 year to the day after the attack, the setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn of Sarah's small house. It was no longer a place of fear, it was a place of community. There was no silent, intimidating guard. Instead, the lawn was filled with the warm sounds of laughter and conversation. Gunny Reyes was at a barbecue grill, flipping burgers. Frank was telling a war story to Jessica Chen and Maria Flores. Detective Wallace, off duty, was there too, sharing a quiet conversation with a few of the other Marines. Sarah stood on her porch, a cup of tea in her hands, and watched the found family that had been forged in the crucible of violence and injustice. The house that had been her prison was now her sanctuary, filled with the very people who had liberated her. As the camera pulled back from the warm, communal scene, a final, documentary-style narration began. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to abandon others in its presence. It's found in the heart of a nurse who becomes a shield for the vulnerable. It's found in the voice of a veteran who refuses to be silenced. It's found in the resolve of a lawyer who fights for the powerless, and in the conscience of a policeman who chooses truth over apathy. In a world of complex systems and quiet indifference, the actions of one woman reminded an entire nation that the most powerful institution of all is human loyalty. And for those who stand guard over others, the watch never truly ends. The final shot was of Sarah, looking out at the gathering of friends on her lawn. A genuine, peaceful smile graced her lips as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, bathing her new world in a soft, hopeful light.